Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about pull requests. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, how do software engineers or how do you keep your pull request small? Well, I am a software developer or software engineer, or however you don't want to define a coder, programmer, person who writes things in a file for money. And how I keep my pull requests small is, well, basically I try to apply the sensible MVP pattern here, where sometimes it's very difficult to keep a pull request small because the feature itself is at an inconvenient size inherently, and I can't really split it into segments. So to kind of walk you through that, an example would be, let's imagine that you were to change, this is a trivial example, but still it's probably one that you're going to see more than once. Let's say that you wanted to change the name of one of your core domain entities within the system. You're just going to change the name of a class that is used everywhere. If you change that name, the reference updates that you're going to make is probably measured in like hundreds of files. Or a classic one is also you change the directory, you move a directory or create a subdirectory or something like that. Also, gigantic explosion of stuff in the pull request. And I actually have some silly coworkers sometimes who kind of go, yeah, well, you should be able to make that smaller. And I kind of go, oh yeah, sure, I can make it smaller, but it is fundamentally, do you want me to move one file at a time so you can check that file? It's a move. It doesn't logically change anything, and you should be able to sort of, I hope, mentally filter that this is not something that you have to pay attention to as much as logical changes to the software. And the same thing goes for like a name change. It's something that you usually can't, there's no nice way of doing it. Like you change the name and all of a sudden there's 100 files, and that makes the pull request quote unquote big. But this I usually feel like subjective things like this that are very much up to personal taste. It's never like, it never really becomes a there's never a definitive way how to solve this problem. I can give you my guidelines, on the other hand, for when you're not in a situation like what I just described, where you simply cannot really, in a pragmatic way, make the job easier for the reviewer. But when you can, it's usually when, let's say that you're working on a feature where you can actually ship one piece of the software without shipping the whole thing, and ship things in segments, if that makes sense. Like a really bad example of that would perhaps be that let's say that you were working on a new feature and you realize that you're adding something to an old legacy component, and that component doesn't have any tests, for example. Well, if you're going to make a pull request for like because you might want to Boy Scout that thing, right? Then a good and nice thing to do is perhaps to either, depending on how you have to deal with this thing, you might want to do the Boy Scouting in a separate pull request. So you basically ship the functionality, or you create a pull request for the work that you are supposed to be doing, like the amendment or whatever. Let's say that you're fixing a bug or something like that, and then you add the Boy Scouting as a separate pull request, because you can segment it that way. It's still one chunk. Now, there is another pattern that you can use. I've never really like, it does work, but once again, it very much depends on the situation and how you want to deal with this thing. Another example of how you can make a pull request really small, where it's actually very useful. There are people who will advocate, guys, for like these sort of micro merges, where you might actually, and I've worked with a guy who was like, if programming was a religion, he would be at some type of bishop, I swear. Super energetic guy, but super annoying to have a conversation with, because he would go to the point where literally merging a class definition, or like a variable, or like we're going down to the microest of changes that you can possibly imagine, and he would be very upset if he was not allowed to do this. And so we had to have a conversation with him and try to sort of explain that, dude, you are not making a micro pull request for you. You're making it for me. I'm the reviewer. I'm the person who's supposed to review this thing. And if I'm telling you that this is getting tedious for me, then probably we should have a conversation, because we're supposed to work as a team. It's not about you getting to prove that you have fully understood whatever Bible of programming you have read. It is about us effectively working as a team. But there is an instance where that level of like really micro-merging things does make sense. A classic one is, I've mentioned this a few times before, guys, that some features, let's say that you have a backend team and a front-end team working together, and you're going to establish some type of new functionality which requires a new domain entity. Now, if you're doing that, almost always you start with defining the class or the model that you're going to use for, I don't know, a user, a product, or some new type of entity, right? And so in an instance like that, like I usually advocate for the front-end developers to use an interface and work from their perspective, and then the back-end developers work from their perspective, and then you meet in the middle once you're both sort of done, and then you kind of you fit the JSON or like whatever response is coming from the server into the front-end model. Unfortunately, the common practice in front-end is that you just use whatever the backend is sending as is, which I think is ignorant and very stupid, but it is the way that people are doing it. So when that is happening, a very nice thing that the backend developers could do in this scenario is to basically just declare an initial model. You just say, here is the class or whatever you might be using. You don't have to use a class, of course, or the DTO. Define the fields, define the types, and then merge that as part of the bigger story that you're doing. So you make a micro merge so that the class is there, because that gives some type of stub endpoint so that the front-end developers can just connect to that endpoint and get some mock version of that data back, or something similar like that, because that means that now that functionality is in the actual, like it's in master, and the front-end developers are unblocked and they can start using that model instead of having to wait for you to finish all of the logic that you might be implementing on the back end. So what I want you to take away from this is that the way that I try to keep my pull requests small it's very simple. I try to think in terms of segments that I can break my work out into that makes sense, so to speak. I very rarely go to like these micro levels, as I was saying, because it can get really silly where like you're like merging arbitrary like one test or one variable or one class. It really comes down to sort of, is this value building, yes or no? So I try to think in those sorts of segments. This thing here, why do I want to merge this first? Well, usually when I come to the conclusion that I want to segment out my pull request into smaller pull requests is because I've figured out that I can ship this thing here, the MVP thinking, right? I can ship this thing and it's going to provide some type of value either for one of my coworkers because they need the code in master so they can work, or maybe it's a user who wants to try a feature out quicker or something like that. There is some reason that I want to merge this as quickly as possible, and then I figured out that I have a bunch of other stuff that can be merged later, and so I do the merge. I create the pull request for that piece, and then I fork off and I start working on the next thing, right? And as I said, a classic example is I find something that is sort of ugly and I want to do some Boy Scouting, but because I don't want to dilly-dally for too long with the actual implementation, I do the implementation first, and then I separate the Boy Scouting into a separate pull request so that the code reviewer doesn't get confused by like, oh, why are you changing so many things? You were just supposed to be doing this thing. It's the general way that I try to do it. Have a great day.